In this episode, we had a conversation with 6 times company founder, medical technology executive Lahav Gil, the founder of Kangaroo Ventures. Together with Lahav, we explored his childhood memories to unleash the source of his entrepreneurial spirit. He shared his magic cathedral philosophy behind creating medical technologies. As a passionate mentor and investor for startups, Lahav highlighted an urgent need for upgrading the global education system to foster innovation. If you would like to hear the story of a self-made innovator and his values, this video is for you.
Probably just a very curious individual who has certain knacks, certain capabilities that were always evident. I was always very artistic inclined, so I had a creative artistic inclination, and I was always very, very technical. I had a very technical inclination. When I was a kid, you'd always find me with tools in my hands, and I would be fixing things around the house, and if my parents wouldn't watch, then the car would be kind of semi-dismantled, and then I'd build it up again, and I would paint. And I think if you go around and look at industrial designers, which is my core profession, so that's kind of what I studied later, you'd see that most of the people who are industrial designers are kind of built from these two elements of creativity and technical together. It's a very strong makeup for industrial design. And for me, a little bit later in life, I became very interested in context, in why we do things at work. I mean, I was interested in why even as a kid, but more as from a professional perspective, I always had this hunger to know why we're doing what we're doing. What's the purpose? What's the reason? What's the context? And in work life, that context is really called business. So I learned about business goals, business strategies, business implementations, and I integrated that into the creative and technical. Mm-hmm. And then a little bit later on in life, I learned a little bit about science. Not a lot, more through experience, but I learned how to interact or work very closely with scientific people or doctors, physicians, clinicians, and to listen to them very well, and then to integrate their thoughts and their ideas into my little world of creativity, design, engineering, and business strategies. And that turned into kind of what I do in life today, in work life today, which is the idea of, they call it MedTech, so that's the industry, that's the business, MedTech innovation, commercialization, and entrepreneurship, which is, I think basically it's when you take potentially innovative and impactful medical and scientific ideas, and you develop them, you evolve them so that they can become products, devices, and businesses, so that they can be diffused into the world and have an impact on people's lives.
Since you were a kid, you were a creative, curious kid, at the same time very handy. So you think that it's coming from your birth?
For me, I found myself like this. Right? So as a child, I discovered myself. I discovered this by doing. I didn't plan for it. I didn't want it. I think we talked about this at the restaurant. Even in my 20s, there was no name for it. We didn't really know that entrepreneurship or this creative drive or this drive to innovate, we didn't even know that it has a name back then, and we didn't even know that we're supposed to want it. Like we talked about the hype for entrepreneurial whatever today, and everybody wants to be an entrepreneur, or many people, and people are pushed in the direction of entrepreneurship. When I was in my 20s, we didn't know this. When I was 5 or 6, who would have thought about this? Can you teach it to somebody who doesn't have any of it? My feeling is that you can't. It's going to be very clunky. Somebody might learn the motions, but I think some people have. I think we should accept that different people are just born somewhat differently, even though we're all born from the same template. Right? We all have 5 hands and a head. Can't change that mostly, but each of us have got a little bit of a different hand and a little bit of a different head, and we're kind of wired a little bit differently. I wanted to tell this story of as a child I was very curious about the light, and I realized that there's a connection between what happens in the outlet, because I saw my grandparents, they were switching on electrical devices, and I saw the light, so I thought, well, I can probably take a light bulb and connect it to the outlet, and it'll light up.
Wow!
Which is a good idea, right? But but if you take, so I took 2 wires and I stripped 2 wires, and I stuck 1 wire in one side and 1 wire on the other side, and I took the light bulb and I very carefully connected everything together, and the light bulb probably did light up for a split second, but mostly I got electrocuted, and the whole thing
shut down.
Well, this is in 1965, I think. Half of the neighborhood shut down, and I flew back against the wall, and I discovered something about electricity, and about insulation, and about being curious but careful. And I remember that was my first encounter with the power of electricity, but it didn't shut down my curiosity and creativity. And throughout, a big part of creativity is actually, it's not inventing new things, but it's combining new things from existing inventions. If you look at people who are creative or innovative, mostly what they do, or mostly what we do, is we make new combinations of things. So most of the things exist, and you've got this idea, let's combine this, and this, and the combination is new. Sunlight exists, it's been there forever, and mirrors exist, it's been there forever. But if you manage to take sunlight and mirrors and harness power out of it, that combination was new at some point.
While you were growing up, did you have somebody that you looked up to, so something that kind of helped you to develop those thoughts? I know we talked about your dad, that he had the frame shop. He was the also influencer, or you had somebody else as well?
I don't remember having like a hero, a person. I was always influenced by people. You cannot not be influenced. My dad has always been an innovator. My dad is a creative force. He never stops having ideas, and we also have a history of technical creatives in the family. So his grandfather, this is just at the turn of the previous century, in 1900 and a bit, his grandfather set up electricity in where they were living, in a small village in Russia. And this is at the beginning of so there's no manual, there's no textbook for how to set up your village for electricity, and you can't Google anything. So and there's a kind of a lineage of creativity, of technical creativity in the family. My dad was more artistically creative. He was an artist, and for some part of his life he was a picture framer. So he had his own picture framing workshop, and because he was such an artist, and because in that era picture frames were not commoditized, but they were a more integral part, so framing a piece of art was more an integral part of that art. And he became very sought after and very famous in Israel in the 80s, in the 1980s, as a picture framer. Israeli artists would come and do their entire exhibition. Before exhibiting it, there was a lineup. He was never short on work. And I was very influenced, I think, by that. Especially since he put me to work when I was 12. When I was 12 years old, he put sandpaper in my hand and showed me the backyard where there was a pile of picture frames, and he showed me how to sandpaper, how to sand the frames, the wood, and make it very, very, very smooth. There was a pride in the family about how smooth the picture frames are, because it's not easy to there's a quality attached to having a finished piece of wood which is very, very smooth. Because what happens when you paint it, right? So it's raw wood, it's put into a frame, it's adapted artistically to a specific work of art, and then it gets sanded, and then it gets painted, and then when it gets painted, the wood kind of comes up again and it's rough again, so you sand it again, and then you paint it again, and you sand it again, and you paint it again. And this whole process eventually produces a very, very high quality finish. And we would pride ourselves at how smooth everything comes. But it would take hours of sandpapering. And that's what I did for the first 3-4 years of working for him. I was just the sandpaper guy. But I did learn how to do all of the other parts of the process of picture framing, and I worked for him for many years, even through school and through high school and through my military service. All my vacations were basically all my time off was basically in his shop, and I learned also. So he paid me from day one. I always worked for money, and or for pocket money. He didn't really pay me physically, but we had like a tally sheet. Okay, and so I always had this account. I felt very, very powerful, very capable. I could basically do whatever I wanted from a money perspective, because I always had this account with him. I didn't have to ask for permission to do the things that I wanted to buy. There was always money there for me, which I worked for. So all I had to ask for is to get, I only had to ask for the money that belonged to me anyway if I wanted to buy something. So that was very empowering as a child, to always have your own money account. That was great. So if I wanted to go overseas, I could buy my air ticket with my own money from that account, which was great. And then later on, when he decided to move on and do something else, for a few years I continued his shop, and then I kind of wound it down. But over the course of of those few years, I learned about work. I learned about being in service. I learned about wood and paints and carpentry, and really my first own profession, my profession, where I actually started to make a living for myself, was in carpentry. I transitioned from picture framing to cabinet remaking or custom carpentry, and eventually I opened my own carpentry workshop, and I transitioned some of the tools, some of my dad's tools, transitioned them into my tools, and kind of built up a little carpentry shop and made furniture for people. And then you can ask, so were you an entrepreneur? I guess looking backwards, then yeah, so that's entrepreneurship, right? You have a wish to do something, and you do it. Option two is you want to do carpentry and you go work for somebody else and you learn from somebody else. Well, I learned on the fly, and I've always learned on the fly. I'm very much autodidact. I actually don't like structured learning, and I'm not good at it. If you put me in a classroom, I have a difficulty, maybe I even have some sort of learning disability. Very difficult for me to take in new knowledge. It's always been like that. I was a really, really bad student. Bad as in I just couldn't do it. It's the classic. My parents would always come to these meetings, and for years they would always hear the same thing. Your son has a lot of potential, the teachers would say, but he's not doing anything with it. And that's what they thought. I think I was trying quite hard, but I couldn't really take in the information. And at some point I just realized that I can get by with 60 or 70. That was enough. That was easy. So, and I didn't try to go above that. And the interesting thing is that so friends of mine know me, and they know that I never had the drive for excellence in studies when I was a child. And later in life, I don't know how it happened, but I developed a drive for excellence in my work. But I didn't have that as a kid. I had a get-by mentality as a kid. Let's do the minimum necessary in order to get through this. And I couldn't wait. It wasn't fast enough for me to finish school. I couldn't wait long enough, or I just wanted school to be done, and then I wanted high school to be done. And then I didn't even think about university. Wasn't a consideration for us. For Israelis, then you go to the army. You have 3 years of compulsory military service, and I happened to be a soldier when Israel was in the beginning of a conflict in Lebanon. So I was also part of that conflict as a soldier. I started working for myself when I came back from the military. It was just natural, just to do the carpentry thing, because I just gravitated to that. It was very enjoyable. I loved working with wood. I still do. I love the smell of wood as you work with it. Many people have that, right? It just smells so good when you work with it, or when you put a little bit of water on it, and every wood smells a little bit different. And anyways, I still do. I still love working with wood. It's always been, and I've been working with my hands all of my life. Since I started with my dad, but even before that, it was just I was the kind of kid that blows things up in the backyard, and so
You wanted to say something.
climbs up the tallest trees and falls off and goes to hospital. I was very, very adventurous, very curious, and I think that is something. If we're kind of trying to relate it to your original question, I don't think that this is easily taught systematically. The curiosity, the doing the things that are forbidden. Some kids are like that. You see them. They've got blue knees, and they're always a little bit rough around the edges because they're doing the stuff that they shouldn't, and they're building up these little rockets in their backyard. And the last rocket I ever flew was one that exploded into my eyes. We were experimenting with all of these homemade rockets. This is when I was 12. Actually, just before. It was 11 and a half, between 11 and a half and 12. And I remember this distinct day. From that day on, I did not do any more rockets. My mom was in the living room with a few of her friends. She was doing continued education, and they were doing it. She's a gym teacher, gymnastics teacher. They were all studying together, and I was secretly in the backyard building the biggest rocket I've ever done. And after I lit it up, it just didn't. Something didn't go. So I'm waiting, and I just got impatient. So I finally came closer to see what's going on. As I looked at it blew up, and I was so close, it blew up literally in my face, and for the first few seconds I couldn't see, so everything turned black, and I couldn't hear anything, and I got so scared. I thought that I had blinded myself. I thought that I went blind, but then I felt all these things in my face. After a few seconds, I opened my eyes and I could see. So after the blackness disappeared, I still couldn't hear. There was like a huge dong in the ear, and I ran into the house, into the bathroom, into the mirror, to look at the mirror to see what happened to my face. So it turned out that my face was just covered in dirt, all these spots. So the rocket didn't explode, it actually took off.
Mm-hmm.
And what exploded was behind it, and it made this little crater, but I was so close that everything went into my face. And I couldn't hear properly for a few days after this, but then it slowly went away. My mom didn't discover it. They were so intense into their studies. She didn't even know what was going on, but I think at that point I decided that rockets is not my thing anymore. But but I was just very curious. I was just very curious, and I had all these ideas. I had and I had an impulse or not a compulsion to do these ideas. So I had a thought, build a rocket, and I would go and do it. And I had a thought, build a house, build a tree house, and I would do it. And I had a thought, build a pigeon house, and then I would do it. And I'm still like that today. There's a very quick connection between the idea and the need, the compulsion to do something about it. It's almost like a fear that if I don't do something about it, the ideas will stop coming. I have this weird thing. It's like I think that the relationship between me and whatever turns the ideas in me, I don't think it's the same thing. I think that there's something in me that produces all these ideas. And I've always thought that if I don't do something about these ideas, eventually the ideas would stop.
Why do you think so?
I don't know. It's a little superstition. It's a little superstition which I've always had since I was a child. Mm-hmm. So when I have an idea, I put awareness into it, and I put thought into it, and I write it down, and then I do something about it. I try to move it forward. And I also have this, like many creative people have a drawer or a notebook or a place where I put all these ideas. The ones that are not good enough to be executed, or maybe you don't have enough time, or you're busy with another idea. So I have this huge pile of ideas. They never stop, never stop coming. And there's another thing I should say. Sometimes, and this is in recent years, on a day, on a weekend, or sometimes there's like a half day where there's nothing. There's no. It's just so weird. I have no. It's like a half day of quiet. The brain goes quiet. There's no new ideas, and I just wait for it to start again. When you're trying to develop medical technologies, you can't just answer to one stakeholder. You can't just solve one problem. Mm-hmm. It's not enough. The problem is multidimensional, right? There's a clinical problem, there's a user problem, there's a financial problem, there's an ecosystem problem, I don't mean problem in a negative way. It's just an unsolved, a mystery, an yes. unsolved thing, a mystery thing, an unresolved thing, sometimes known as a problem. Engineers call this a problem. And engineers go through a process called problem formulation. When they have an idea or when they see something that needs solutions, they go through a problem formulation process where they take the time to study and to deeply understand what the problem is that they're trying to solve. In MedTech, which is kind of my world today, and in general in technology, innovation and entrepreneurship, it's a multidimensional problem. It's not one thing that you're trying to solve. It's not enough to solve one thing. If you want to commercialize something, you have to actually identify each component of this multidimensional problem, and then be able to build a solution that actually resolves all of these problems for all of these stakeholders, or for the majority of these stakeholders. So one such problem is always the cost of healthcare. So when you've got a great healthcare or medtech or health tech idea, one of the things you have to consider is how this idea is going to reduce the cost of healthcare in general, because every country in the world has this problem. Mm-hmm. The cost of providing health for citizens or for society is going up and up and up and up, and therefore the quality of the healthcare that we get as citizens goes down and down and down. Mm-hmm. And then I'm kind of making it more simple than it is. There's other things, but if you want to help people, you have to be able to solve the user problem. You have to be able to solve the health economics problem. You have to make an impact on the way health care is administered and reduce the costs. In the last 15 years, I've had this fabulous luck and privilege to work alongside many MedTech startups here in Canada. You wanted to ask me about my experience in Israel, and we can go back to that. But it's my last 15 years in Canada which have given me a tremendous acceleration and a tremendous experience, just because I've worked alongside so many MedTech startups, Canadian MedTech startups, some successful, some not, and some in the middle, which is kind of the most painful place to be. It's easier to find out that you're successful or to find out that you've missed the point. The middle is tough. So my journey is a journey of learning. I've been learning, and today, if you take the learning and the practical experience that I've gathered, and you mix it with this creativity that's always been there for me, and the inventiveness, the need. I almost have a need to do things in a different way. It's difficult for me to do things the same way that they've been done before. I have to do it differently. And the curiosity and this drive to do something about the ideas that I have. You take all of this and you add the professional experience, then people come to me for that combination, because they know that if they show me their core idea, their scientific idea, or their innovation, I will know how to build it or envision it into a product and into a business, because you need to do both.
Exactly.
You can't just envision a product. You have to envision a product and a business, and they work together. The product and the business influence each other. The architecture of the product and the architecture of the business, they work together, and they include the core scientific or clinical invention. You have to align these three dimensions: the core idea, the product or device as it's called, and the business. And in more professional language, it's the invention, and then so the core invention, and then the application. The product is called the application, and then the business is usually referred to as the distribution. You've got the invention, application, and distribution, or in lay terminology, it's the idea, the product, and the business.
Some of the scientists, they work on the idea either within the university or by themselves, and they not all the time integrate it with business people to turn it into reality.
That's very true. But you're right. There has to be a transition from scientific savvy to business savvy. If you're intending to commercialize what you're working on, it's not a must. Not everything has to be commercialized, and not everybody has to be a commercializer.
If you're, let's say, a scientist in medical, if you cannot commodize it, then what's the point of that invention? People won't be able to use it. You need business people to be able to do that. Otherwise, it's just the idea, it's just the research paper. So it doesn't move the people, it doesn't help people, right?
That's true. The goal of science is eventually to have impact on people's lives, to make things better, to have impact on the world. That is the ultimate goal of science. But I would say it doesn't have to be the ultimate goal of every little invention. There is value in just broadening the breadth and the depth of human knowledge. Not every idea has to be commercialized. And also, I also think that if as a species or as a humanity, we will be very tight about this idea that everything has to be commercialized, then we will miss a few great opportunities. Because some really fantastic things actually they spring out of a more relaxed environment, I believe. So I think we need both. We need scientists who get really, really interested in something in their own little world, and they kind of dig a hole deeper and deeper and deeper, and it goes nowhere from a commercial perspective. But it advances human knowledge. And their PhD or their research would sit on the shelf somewhere, and maybe nothing would come out of it. Still, there's value in that process. And we need scientists that are working towards a commercial end. And we need everything in between. And sometimes these ideas feed these ideas, and vice versa. but I would very much agree with what you're saying, is that if somebody is working on something and they have a wish to commercialize, then they should integrate their scientific thought and discovery process and validation process with an application and a business model, a business architecture, because otherwise they're just naive. We've created a whole methodology around this idea and storytelling and modeling around this idea, because we've interacted. When I say we, I mean Kangaroo, which is the company that I formed 15 or 16 years ago. I did form a company called Kangaroo. Initially it was called Kangaroo Design, and then it evolved into Kangaroo Design and Innovation, and then it evolved into, I think, Kangaroo Product Development, and then into Kangaroo Group. But the core of the business was around services for technology entrepreneurs in order to help them develop their ideas into products and into businesses. So there was a whole methodology around this idea, and I kind of described it in short. We called it the Cathedral Methodology. And do you want me to tell you the story? Okay. Okay, we called it the Cathedral Methodology, and the methodology or the model is very simple. It says that there's 3 distinct dimensions to a venture that tries to commercialize a technology. So at the heart there's the core invention, and then around it there is the product, and around it there's the business. As I mentioned earlier, we would call it the innovation, the application, and the distribution, to speak like an MBA person. And the idea here basically says that if you want to be successful, you have to make sure that there is an alignment between these 3 spheres. Why am I doing these shapes with my hands? Because the model is concentric circles or spheres. And you almost have to envision that the core idea has to be surrounded by a product, and then the product has to be surrounded by a business. Or sometimes we say that the core idea needs to be gets born into the world through the product, and the product gets born into the world through the business. Those are the imageries. Now, why do we call this the Cathedral Model? It's based on an urban story. There's like an urban tale. The story goes something like this. So imagine 400 years ago, there's a person walking down the street in Europe somewhere, let's say Barcelona or and they see 2 people on the side of the street, and each one is sitting by a pile of rocks, and they're chipping at these rocks. They're making each rock into what's called a masonry block. They're turning rocks into masonry blocks. And this person goes to the first person by that pile, and they ask them, what are you doing? And the person looks up and say, well, I'm turning these rocks into masonry blocks. I'm chipping away, and that's what I'm doing. And then they ask the second person, what are you doing? And that person says, well, I'm building that church over there. I'm building that cathedral over there. Apparently, it looks like they're doing the same thing, but each one of them is chipping away at these rocks, turning them into masonry blocks. But one person is doing just that, and one person actually believes and is building a cathedral.
I see.
Okay, so you could say, well, they're doing the same thing, but they're not. Each one of them is actually doing something different, for real. One of them is making blocks, and the other is building a cathedral. And just that mindset, the ability to, whilst you're making the block, to know that you're building the cathedral, that mindset has a tremendous effect on what you're doing. It will affect the workmanship. It will affect the attention to detail. It will affect what you put into the stone as you do it, because you're putting yourself in there. And there's more to it. Now, you take this story and then you roll it 40 years down the road, And each one of these people who are sitting there is walking along that street and with their grandchild, and they're holding their grandchild in hand. And the first one will be able to tell their grandchild, you see, my child, 40 years ago, I was working here and I made these masonry blocks from a pile of rocks. And the other person will be able to say, 40 years ago, we built this cathedral. Mm-hmm. And both stories will be true. One person made blocks and the other built a cathedral. And that's where, so the cathedral model, these concentric circles, basically say that if you're a scientist and you're chipping away at your invention somewhere in a corridor at the university on your bench, and you're chipping away, if you want to commercialize, you have to be building a cathedral in your mind. Mm-hmm. You cannot be just making masonry blocks. You have to think cathedral. Means that you have to think about the business architecture, and you have to think about the product application and how your scientific invention will morph into a product and will morph into a business. And we call that cathedral thinking. It kind of explains why there's so many arguments in the industry. Why you sit in the room with a few people, you're trying to talk about the same thing, but an argument ensues. The reason, according to the cathedral model, is that each one is basically living, each one of the people, the scientists are talking in the scientific sphere. The product people, the engineers, the industrial designers are talking in that sphere. And the business people are talking in that sphere. And they can have the same conversation, but they think they're arguing. The truth is that each one of them basically sees a different dimension in the story. And I believe that all three types of people, or all three groupings, need to be educated to see things from and with the perspective of the other dimensions in order to have an integrative conversation. It's also important to remember that within each sphere there's different sets of requirements. I don't know if we talked about this, but products, devices, get designed according to requirements. You can't just design something. There need to be design requirements. This product is required to do something. Like a table, one of the requirements for a table is that it will have a flattish type surface which is elevated about 73 centimeters from the floor height. That's kind of a basic general requirement from a dining table. And the requirements for a side table or a coffee table are that it'll have a flattish type of surface elevated at around 45 centimeters from the floor. That's just one requirement, right? You can also add requirement that it is stable enough, doesn't rock too much, and so on and so forth. It's not a requirement that it'll have feet or legs, for example. That's a solution. That's a design solution, right? A table can be a block. If it's a block of concrete that could function, that block of concrete will probably answer the requirement that that's a flattish sort of surface around 70 centimeters from the floor. Okay, but that might not answer another requirement, which is easily movable inside the house. That's another requirement. I think what I'm trying to demonstrate or to make tangible here is that when you design things or when you engineer things, you do it towards a set of requirements. And either the requirements are very clear, so there's a list, so it needs to, required to do this, and this, and or they are assumed. But when you get into this design process, you'll find that anybody who's participating, anybody who's got ideas, let's do it this way, let's do it that way, they suggest their ideas as solutions to a requirement or a set of requirements that they have envisioned in their head. The thing is that the scientists, so if you go back to the cathedral model, the scientists work to a set of requirements that are more to do with science and the scientific performance and validation. The product people work to a set of requirements that are mostly to do with usability and with industrial manufacturing processes. And the business people work from a set of requirements that answer business needs, business goals, certain margins for profitability, certain IP protection, intellectual property protection fences or parameters, certain ability to scale and to create, let's say, frictionless distribution, branding. So the scientist has their idea about something, and they're trying to perfect the scientific process, whilst the salesperson who operates in the business sphere is thinking about how they will sell it. And obviously they're having an argument because it's a different set of requirements, different set of interests. Also, it's a different set of schooling. They come from a different school and so on, but they're talking about the same idea. So the Cathedral Model aims to amalgamize all of this and to teach everybody the language of the different spheres, so that we can have less dysfunctional discussions and more functional discussions, and basically call it out and say, let's just talk about the science now, or let's just talk about the business now, and let's just see how we align the science with the business, or with the technical or with the technical requirement, because sometimes there's going to be a clash between a scientific requirement and a technical requirement. For example, you have this many times around products which are autonomous, which have their own battery life.
Yes.
So the scientific process requires a lot, for example, might require a lot of energy, but in order to have that so much energy for so long without being plugged to the wall, you have to attach a very large battery to that thing. And if you attach a very large battery to that thing, sometimes the product becomes not so useful anymore. You can't put it in your pocket. You have to carry the batteries on a cart because they're so heavy. And then that becomes a business hindrance because nobody's going to buy that.
Yes.
So this is where it becomes a very real process, and then you have to be able to think through this. And if you think in isolation, if the engineers only think about reducing the battery size, and they can't go back to the scientific process and ask the scientists to participate in that thinking, or if you don't bring the business people and bring them into the conversation and ask them how they would want to sell it and so on, then if you work in these silos, then you're going to have a hard time commercializing a product. But if you work together, you learn to speak the language and you learn to enjoy the differences, even love the differences, and thrive inside the Cathedral Model.
Yes.
Then eventually you'll have a product that has very, very useful and relevant technology, surrounded by a great product that all the users love and can adopt. So because you've eliminated all the barriers to adoption at the usability level, and it's going to be surrounded by a business model that will create an adoption curve. I've always loved education, and I've always hated education. So I've had this mixed relationship. I've never gotten along with the systematic education of schools. I can appreciate that it's needed. I appreciate that you need systems, you need processes, you need structures, you need a lot of repetition in order to educate and to teach. You need to exercise. There's the assimilation of new knowledge. It's a whole world. But as a child in the education system, I just couldn't wait for it to end. It didn't work for me. And something that you mentioned, I have this analogy in my head, like the education system, a traditional one. Anybody that pokes their head a little bit above the rest, it's like there's an equalizing knife, kind of. So you learn as a child what is poking their head up. If you're a little bit too humorous, or or you're a little bit jumpy, or you've got ideas. If you're very creative, to the traditional teacher, it's very disruptive. I can't get on with the lesson, the class, the flow. Stop disturbing me. Stand in the corner. I grew up in England, actually, for this. I had 2.5 years in England when I was at the age of 9. So I got very familiar with the British traditional educational system. I actually was in a Church of England school. So, Jewish boy, Church of England school, very traditional. You're less than half my age, right? You're in your 20s, you're 20 something, and I'm in my 50s, mid 50s. I don't know if they do this today, but they used to spank us, the kids, as an allowed part of the educational system. You would get hit So physical punishment was part of the educational system. I do remember the day, the first day at school. Each one of us, each one of the children was called to the teacher, and each one of us received a 12-inch long wooden ruler. Right? You receive a ruler as a gift from the school. Later, to discover what this ruler is used for. Because if you become too happy during class, then
they just use it.
then the teacher calls you up to the front of the class, and you're supposed to come with your ruler. This is 1970s. This is 1970. This is just the year, last year of the Beatles. 1970, 71. The Beatles were still, believe it or not, there was a time on this planet where you'd open the TV and you'd see the Beatles showing live just as Top of the Pops, Sunday night, 7:30 p.m. every Sunday. And you'd come up to the teacher and you'd give her the ruler, and then she would ask you, believe it or not, she would ask you knuckles or knees. That was the question. You had a choice, knuckles or knees. And they would make us come to school with these shorts. You couldn't. So, as a kid, the school didn't allow us to have long pants. So you'd have your shorts as long as you could, and you'd have your socks as high as you could, and you'd have like a little blue, because it'll be cold in the winter. So all of us had these blue areas where we would be freezing. And but our knees were always exposed, so you'd have a choice, knees or knuckles. And if you choose knuckles, then you'd hold out your hand and you'd get hit across your knuckles with your ruler in front of the class, and then you'll go back to sit. And if it's knees, she would hit you with your ruler behind your knees, where the nervous system here is. I usually went for the knuckles. I found each one of us learned where they tolerate the pain better, because we would all get spanked. We were children, and so I was better on my knuckles. But it taught me something. It taught me about what is wrong. Because as a child, I felt that this is wrong. I felt strongly that this is wrong. That this is not okay. I didn't accept it, but I didn't know how to articulate it. But inside of me, I felt that it's wrong for adults to hit children. And later in life, I discovered why it felt so wrong, and I can articulate it today. I know that it's not right for somebody to exert physical punishment on somebody else, just because the other party doesn't have the ability to respond, to hit back, or to protect themselves. And as an adult, you always have that unfair advantage. So you're a grown-up, you're much stronger. It's unfair to use that inequality in order to create that type of hurt, that type of pain. I know that today. I know that it's not allowed. It's not, in American, it's not okay. You cannot hit kids and get away with it. Not in the education system and not at home. Today we've advanced a little bit as a society, at least in parts of the world, and it's criminal. If a parent hits their child at home, they will go to jail if it's discovered. And if it is a repeated, consistent repeated activity, that parent will be separated from their child, because they'll be regarded as abusive, as an abusive parent. But back in the 70s, the British, part of the schooling system, at least in the Church of England schools, used this as, their methodology. I knew it was wrong. I totally knew it was wrong, and today I know how much wrong it is. But if I try to connect this with your question, that's just one expression of how a standardized education system regards creativity and curiosity as a disturbance, and tries to flatten it. Now, mind you, the headmaster at that school had spectacular punishment tools of their own, And if you do something which is, more advanced than just smiling too much at class, you'd be sent to the headmaster, and where you'd get even more physical punishment. And the whole system accepted this as a methodology. It is totally wrong. It is totally wrong. And these people need to be educated. And I think they've gone through their own education process to understand how twisted a system is that allows one person to hit another person, and takes the license to do so because the other person cannot retaliate. These days, I think there is small progression steps in the value system, and in the ability to, and in awareness, and in the ability to articulate things. And you can always take this through, like a teacher can only hit a child so much. When that child becomes 16-year-old and they've been to the gym a little bit, I don't know if I'd come over to hit them. Right? It doesn't work anymore, and that's when you know that's when you know why they allow themselves to do it. But I actually think that the corporate system and the educational system kind of evolve hand in hand, and the hierarchy, the need to control, also probably evolves hand in hand with the governance or civic system. There's definitely a need to control people, and partially because most of us are out of control. And if you let everybody drive at the speed that they want, many people will overspeed. So there is a need to exert some kind of control system, but it's a good question. Have we overdone it? Probably. We've probably been overdoing it for years, and maybe the system is afraid of the people. There's a whole methodology that thinks that people don't know enough. They have to be protected from themselves. Right? There's a whole kind of hierarchy or pyramidical structure that we were born into. There's always somebody who knows better than us. They'll tell us, they'll make up the rules, and then they'll make sure that the rules are enforced. And there is a bit of truth to it, but that type of thinking, I think, puts a lot of constriction on the ability of humans at a large scale to evolve. Because if you have that mindset that people don't know and they need to be controlled, and then how are we ever going to be? How are we going to evolve? How is the neighbor going to think the next creative thought if when they were at school and they had a creative idea, the teacher treated that as a disturbance, and when they had more than one creative idea, it was a growing disturbance, and that child would be pointed to as a disturbance in class because the teacher couldn't get her material through, and that child would be hit a lot, and they would over time associate the pain, the punishment, and the fear with the creative surge. So that creative surge will slowly die down. Why didn't it die down for me? I do not know, but I was rebellious. To me, the more they tried to control me, the more rebellious I became, and the more I was single. So it was like a chicken and egg and a snowballing thing. And the more they thought, this is really a bad kid, right? So there wasn't enough insight at that time to say, this is a really creative person who's having a hard time with the system. What can we do about it? What can we do? Today, if I go to where my wife is, to where my spouse is, today the educational system is way more open, is quite amazingly open, and some of the most advanced concepts of education have really switched polarities. So we don't see education anymore as a process where one person, the teacher, puts knowledge into other people or another person. It's kind of switched polarity, and people talk about the learning process, and the focus is on the learner rather than on the teacher. The teacher is more regarded as a facilitator of learning processes. So we teach children today, but we try to teach children today to be good learners, to be experiential learners. Like for me, if somebody knew back then that I am an experiential learner, maybe the problem would have been solved, but nobody had that thought. Nobody knew about experiential learning. Just sit and study was the concept. There is a very large gap, I find, between the value system that is upheld inside educational institutions versus the value system that is upheld outside. I'll explain a little bit of what I mean. When you go to a university, so higher education, people in their teens, 18 and up, or even in high school, what I find that many of the teachers will uphold a very refined or a high value system. So we talk about the goodness of the world, and we talk about advancing the goodness in the world, and we talk about having a belief system in one's life and having a value system and operating from those values. It's very rare that you'd enter a class for people at the age of 16 and somebody is hammering the idea of money and profit making into them. Yes. Mostly you'd see educators telling people about values. Right? There's knowledge that has to be transferred or needs to be adopted or learned, but there's the values. We talk about, we hear and talk about, what is life for, what is life about, discovering one's own journey in life, being a good citizen, whatever that means, being a good person, understanding the values from which you operate, and basically, I think in many places people are told and repeatedly told that participating in the constructive part of society is actually a good thing, and you want to contribute to the greater good. Obviously, you want to have a benefit come back to you as a person, but I think if I look at some of the education that my children got here at not too far down the street at Lyon Mackenzie, the teachers were very very clear in guiding children in a good direction, to become more and more a contributing, giving, good, healthy participant in society. And you could say, and in the advancement of the human species. We want to become a better species. We want to also become better individuals. But that is not the message outside of school. And I find it very disturbing. I find it very disturbing because at some age, the children, they're not dumb, they're actually quite smart, quite bright. And they start to realize that the background music of the world outside of school is different. Actually, it's quite the opposite. And there begins to be this, because they get it from TV, right? What are the movies about? They get it from the news. What is the news about? Where is all this goodness that the teachers are telling us? Where is it? Where does it go? You can't benefit, right? The message of the world is that you can't benefit in life if you're all about goodness. You have to go out and get something for yourself. And the message of the importance of money, aggressively important, is kind of the background music of the world. So you already begin as a child at the age 15, 16, 17, you already begin to feel that there is some kind of a lie in the system, or that at least there is a gap between the world of education and the world of outside of education. Let's just call, I don't want to say the world of the real world, because both are parts of the real world. Yes. But you begin to feel that dissonance, and I personally want to make that dissonance disappear. I want the world outside of school, the world of work, of business. I want the world of business and of work to operate from exactly the same values as family life, from exactly the same values as educational life. There shouldn't be even 1 millimeter of discrepancy. I cannot accept this saying that everything is, in business everything is okay. It's not okay. Why should there be a difference between how somebody conducts themselves at work versus how they conduct themselves at home with their children?
Mm-hmm.
Is there any reasonable, is there any reason for this difference? I don't see why. Why should we be ruthless and aggressive in business and it's considered something good? And why should we be caring and loving with children as it's considered something good? I think a whole generation feels that something is like totally wrong here. Something is wrong. There has to be a continuum between the value system with which we raise children and we educate them, and then we send them into the journey of their life. There has to be a continuum of the value system. We cannot just say, okay, that was just school, and now you have to be ruthless and aggressive, and now you're allowed to lie, and you have to be afraid, and it's okay because it's allowed in business. That doesn't make sense to me. If the human race manages to immigrate to another planet and to populate it, what will we bring with us? Will we bring with us, the fresh winds and the green grass of a highly refined value system, of kindness, of meaningfulness? Will we bring these things, or will we bring with us, political behavior and fear and punishment? Or will we bring with us both of them? The Zen you find on the top of the mountain is the Zen that you bring with you. I think for good and for bad, we bring with us to new places the best of ourselves and the worst of ourselves and everything in the middle. I think it's the job of all of us at all ages to have enough of an introspective process in life, enough of to have a space in life, in each individual life, which is introspective, which is reflective, self-reflective, where you actually look in the mirror and you spend time, a few minutes a day or a few hours a day, based on your inclination, to reflect on the self. Not self-consciousness, not in that sense, but to actually have a reflective process about oneself and about the best of oneself and the worst of oneself and the everything in the middle. And this process includes decisions about how to conduct oneself, how to improve oneself. And sometimes it's hard work to change even the smallest of habits. This can be as simple as, people are stuck in traffic on the highway and they get annoyed. Okay? We all know that. Sometimes that annoyance is, within the realms of control. Sometimes it gets out of control. Somebody loses their temper so much that they become violent. There's names for this. I think it's called road rage. People beep to one another when they become mildly violent, and then some people will, step out of their car and go grab somebody and hit them. Okay, so first that I think this just, firstly, it says that we all live in a very stressful environment. The stress levels of everybody is pretty high. But it also says that most of us, whilst we're driving on the highway, we don't practice a lot of thought. We don't think too much. We don't think, we don't cool ourselves through thinking. Because if you'd spend a few minutes thinking about it, then you'll know that the moment you receive your driver's certificate, you basically opt into the idea of traffic jams. Mm-hmm. And you know what? You're part of it. The moment you get a driver's license, you begin your participation in creating traffic jams. It's not everybody out there doing bad things to you. You're part of it. It's part of the way this thing works. It comes with your driver's certificate. So think about it. Learn to accept it. And that's kind of the basis, the basic foundation from which a person needs to be sitting in their car as they're sitting in traffic along the highway, the foundational thought and the foundational awareness needs to be such that yes, this is part of what driving is about, and a person needs to train themselves into a habitual thinking process and also into a habitual feeling process that does not become irritated or violent because of a trivial thing like a traffic jam. Like, what's the big deal? It's just a traffic jam. It's gonna be like that tomorrow also, and the day after. It's part of driving. Another part of it is that there's really no utility in becoming annoyed with something that you cannot change.
What are the few values that you kept since you were a child?
For me, integrity is a big one for me. So I have a natural tendency towards it, and I think most of us actually build our value systems on things which are natural to us. So for me, integrity, being very close to the cause, being very close to truth, being very close to my own truth, that's what I define as integrity, very important to me. If I stray a little bit too far from it, it becomes painful for me. So that's always directed me, and I've made it into a value. So I value it, it's important for me. I repeatedly teach myself that it's important to me, and I will talk about it with other people. Another one is meaning. Maybe that one is probably the strongest one for me. I put a lot of value on meaning. Now, meaning and value they kind of intermix a little bit. So it's like you need one in order to understand the other. What are the values? What are a person's values? Is the things that mean something to them, or the things that are important. What is meaning? Things that have value for you. So they kind of interchange. Nothing I can do about it. But I kind of travel loosely in my mind between these concepts, and they reinforce one another. So meaning is another one. It's very important for me, which is another way to say what are your values. It's what's important for you. It's very important for me that the things that I do and the things I participate in and the things that I give of myself to have a meaning for me, and have a meaning in the world, in the way I see the world, in my cosmology, in my fundamental paradigm of how I see the world. It has to have a meaning for me. I need to understand why. I need to understand why it's important and why I do it, and that's a huge value for me. The other thing, which is funny to say, it's values. I value values. I value values. I think that the awareness to values, trying for each person to try to understand what are my values, and then to make sure that my life and how I go about my life is aligned with these values, or at least comes closer and closer in alignment with these values, because sometimes we stray away, and then we need to kind of come back and regroup and go back find a way back into our value system. So values are a value of mine. And another big thing for me is relationships. So I really value relationships. I truly value human development. So you can say personal development. The idea that a person is not a fixed thing. You are not a fixed thing, I'm not a fixed thing. But we have the potential to be better. I truly value that. I don't really know what life is about if it's not about that. If it's not about personal development, it's not about the reflective process that a person has between them and them. You could almost say that it is a spiritual belief for me. So it's not just logical. I cannot logically explain it. It's to do with a more mystic perception that I have towards life and towards being a human. I value the idea that a human has the potential to change.
What makes you happy in life?
Mostly usefulness. being useful. I really get a lot of happiness from being useful, but I should almost warn you, I've never really seen happiness as the big attainment. It's important, and I think it's better to be happy than not. It's one. I know that I get more happy when I'm useful, when I have something useful to do. But there's so many levels to happiness. I mean, you can take a basketball and go out and just have a tremendous time, and you come back and you're just happy. And what is that? How do you explain that? How do you explain that type of happiness? Or you go and you swim 30 laps in a swimming pool, and you come out of it and you feel so happy. How is that? Or what is? You go to a party and you dance, and or you hold hands with somebody you love, or you hug, and you're so happy. So there's so many facets to happiness. It's not just the usefulness part. There's things which are their usefulness is unexplained. What's the usefulness in being happy?